Wood splinters. Beyond the windows, waves crash violently against unseen rocks, their thunder muffled by a thick blanket of fog. A fog so thick it smothers the shore. Between howling gusts of wind, screams and cries for help come from somewhere in the darkness. Out there, hidden by rain and mist, men scream for help. Their cries come in broken fragments, thrust ashore between whips of wind before their mighty force grabs them away again. No one needs to ask what happened. They already know. Another ship has found the rocks. Point Judith in Narragansett, Rhode Island, is both beautiful and deadly. For more than 2 centuries, a lighthouse has watched over these waters molded by thousands of years of storms, shifting currents, and ancient forces, creating a stretch of coast along New England that generations of maritimers have long feared. The perfect storm for ships at sea. Before ships were built or even sailed in these waters, glaciers had already begun shaping Point Judith's deadly character. Massive sheets of ice moved slowly across New England, dragging with them enormous boulders and broken stone. After those glaciers finally vanished, they left behind a coastline of sharp, jagged rock and hidden dangers. On the surface, the ocean appeared endless and calm. The seafloor below, however, told a much different story. A hidden shelf of stone stretched far out into the Atlantic, quietly waiting for ships that ventured too close. Often, the danger was deceptively invisible to those sailors who approached Point Judith. The beautiful coastline gave little warning of what waited below the rippling water. A ship's captain could see land, but not the shoals extending beneath the waves. Before a lighthouse was ever erected on the point, the dark waters silently gathered their claim. Since the beginning of colonial trade in the 1600s, vessels traveling in these coastal waters were regularly forced into unyielding stone. Some were swallowed by blinding fog, while others broke into pieces in the dark during freezing winter storms. The barbarity of Point Judith lay in how closely life and death could walk together on its seaboard. To push back against this relentless danger, an unlit day beacon was eventually raised among the cliffs. While this rudimentary marker could guide mariners through the sunshine, it did nothing but sit in silence against the blinding treachery of the evenings. In April 1728, in the freezing dark, an unidentified sailing vessel traveling from Boston struck the hidden shoals. Crushed by the breakers, its hull instantly broke apart. The ship's mate, in a desperate act of heroism, fought the violent surf, pulling the captain and every single crewman out of the Atlantic and onto dry land. They survived the crash. They survived the frigid, violent water. But the wilderness of the point offered no leniency. Their ice-cold, wet clothes clung to them as they shivered in the midnight blackness, staggering into the coastal brush looking for warmth. It wasn't there. By the sun's early light, the shoreline had claimed them all. Their frozen bodies were scattered along the shore. Some had walked half a mile searching for safety they would never find. It was this tragic loss, the quiet catastrophes of missing sloops and desperate crews, that finally got the world's attention. What mariners needed was not only a light to shine in the darkness, but a landmark, a fixed point that helped them to understand where they were while warning of the danger that lay ahead. In 1810, that alert system took shape on Point Judith. A tower was erected above the coast. This was the first unmistakable mark of the dangerous entrance to Narragansett Bay provided for sailors entering her waters. While this was a turning point for the mariners who navigated the dangerous coast, a tower made of stone and glass is only as good as those who tend it. The relentless Atlantic winds, disorienting fog, and the continuous manual rotation of the heavy brass lens demanded a special kind of resolve, a willingness to forgo a normal life for a life spent awake in the cold midnight hours. Keepers came and went for the first few decades, tired, worn down. The sheer weight of the responsibility coupled with the isolation of living practically on top of the sea. Conversely, in the spring of 1862, a man stepped onto the point who would etch his family name into the rocks of Point Judith. His name was Joseph Whaley, and for a half a century he and his family experienced the possibility of these tragedies daily. This was their life. He and his wife raised a family inside a working lighthouse while living at the edge of the sea, a sea that threatened passing ships, creating a backdrop to their everyday existence. When storms rolled in, they did not simply hear wind and waves. People nearby knew the sounds of tragedy, cries from the men clinging to pieces of splintered broken vessels. Sometimes these men would jump from sinking vessels and be torn up by the pounding waves thrusting them against the invisible shoal. Sometimes people would see them clinging for life and could do nothing but stand helplessly watching the sea take them because it was too violent for anyone on land to enter. As the keeper of the lighthouse, the Whaley family lived with the anxiety of knowing that somewhere in the darkness and fog, a ship could be fighting for its life. Their family home was also his workplace. The safety of every single ship that approached Point Judith depended on him. For less than $1,000 a year, it was his job to keep the light burning to guide the ships at sea. But the quiet isolation that people expected of a lighthouse keeper did not exist here. No, not at Point Judith. In 1 year alone, Joseph counted 37,000 vessels through those coastal waters. The job description of a lighthouse keeper included a crushing test of physical endurance. Day and night, regardless of freezing winter gales or wicked summer storms, Joseph had to manually lug heavy 5-gallon cans of whale oil up the tight, winding circular staircase of the lighthouse. Muscles tense, his legs, arms, shoulders, and back strained from the weight of the oil, coupled with walking up those steps. In the middle of the night, if the oil ran dry, the light would die and the sea would win. Carrying the oil was only a small part of a much larger battle. Up in the glass lantern room, the lamps burned, producing a lot of heat. On those brutal winter nights, if this heat met the frigid ocean air, the windows would instantly fog and freeze. Thick frost would coat the octagonal windows, forcing him to wipe down the massive panes of glass. A ruthless fight against dampness to keep them clear and the beams shining clearly. While the sea raged and the fog rolled in over the bay, he had to keep the windows clear and at the same time meticulously trim the charred wicks of the lanterns every few hours, assuring the flame never smoked or dimmed against the invading rock, racing against the clock to keep the lanterns lit and the glass crystal clear was a constant demand of being a lighthouse keeper at Point Judith. The job proved a psychological nightmare, especially when the weather turned foul. In the late spring of 1889, a stifling, blinding fog grabbed hold of the point and didn't release its grip for weeks. For 375 torturous hours, the station's massive steam whistle sirens shrieked incessantly into the void. 375 hours of deafening mechanical moan emanating every few seconds. shaking windows and floorboards of his home and eliminating any hope of sleep. Enough to drive anyone mad. Stopping the gut-wrenching horn wasn't an option. If the horn went silent, men died. Finally, after 27 years of tireless vigilance, exhausted and worn down from the weight of the several weeks-long noise of the foghorn, Captain Joe, as he was referred to, finally had enough and stepped down. In August of 1889, after 13 years of watching his father and serving as his assistant, Henry Whaley was given the keys. He knew exactly what he was inheriting and what kind of toll watching the sea took on a man. For nearly half a century, the Whaley men kept a desperate watch over the waters that never stopped trying to take the living. His father Joseph spent years fighting the dangers of an unchanged coastal shore. However, as Henry began his watch, the U.S. Congress approved the harbor of Refuge, a massive breakwater stretching into the ocean. Despite man's attempt to protect the coastline, the water refused to submit. The new structures created another hazard for mariners traveling in those waters. Ships continued to succumb to disaster within sight of the lighthouse. For the next several decades, the light continued to shine into the dark waters of the Atlantic around Point Judith. Yet the era of the civilian keeper was coming to an end. In 1939, the centuries-old United States Lighthouse Service was officially dissolved. The old way of doing things, families living atop rocks, had vanished, and the United States Coast Guard took command of Point Judith. Automated electricity, radio beacons, and military precision took over the human efforts of hauling oil and trimming wicks. Civilian keepers packed their bags and left the point, but the warnings remained strong. Glaciers shaped the stone around the coast. Colonial trade brought the victims. Generations of keepers gave their lives standing ready at the watch. The people who kept the watch may be gone, but the responsibility they shouldered remains. The lighthouse in Narragansett, Rhode Island, stands as a true testament of time, a silent guard against the relentless sea, always remembering those lost and guiding those who are still here.